of molecular phylogeny. We use them to depict evolutionary relationships in a visually understandable way for ourselves. And we typically base them, well, at least in molecular phylogeny, we base them upon DNA and protein sequence data. They can take many different forms. This one and this one are pretty similar. This one, if you use a circular tree to portray only 4 sequences, I don't know, you might be a psychopath. Why would you do this? But they're pretty useful when you have like more than 4 sequences. If you have like thousands of sequences, like sometimes I do. But regardless, we're going to go through the nomenclature of phylogenetic trees and what each part of it means and how to interpret them. So this slide is just going to be for your reference. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but all of these points are on these subsequent slides, and we'll go through them one by one. And then you can come back to this as a summary if you want. Okay, anyone know what's coming? All right, before we do that though, I thought about what I could do to make this more fun and like more memorable. And I realized that these things are just, they're the perfect specimens for this phylogenetic analysis, okay? So please bear with me. I'm going to introduce you to 3 groups of organisms for this demonstration, okay? The first is the chonk, okay? It's this cute little dinosaur thing. And it's really chonky, as the picture implies. The second is pengu, okay? I mean, not much to say there. It's a penguin, and it's holding a sword. It wants to be a knight. And the third is duckbill. It's a duck, and it's holding a wrench. Okay, so you know these 3, then you know that then we can continue on. If you know where these are from, good for you. This one is the best, by the way. I will not hear any arguments otherwise. This duckbill is the best. If you don't know where these are from, that's okay. They're just cute animals. You open them in boxes, and the reason why they work well is because they all have these like skin variants where they have different patterns or colors, and then sometimes you can like upgrade them to like a higher tier. So like this one's holding a wooden sword, but this one's holding a real sword. It like leveled up, okay? And so there's a lot of like variation there. Okay, so we can use that to, you know, portray evolutionary relationships, sort of. So yeah, that's that. Okay, so back to our phylogenetic trees. So here's a phylogenetic tree. It's a hypothesis of the relationship between extant species, okay? And then the first thing we're going to look at is the tree itself. So there's kind of 2 main pieces of information you can derive from them. The topology, so the branching pattern, right? And also the branch length, so the length of the edges. So an edge is basically a line, right? That's an edge, that's an edge, that's an edge, that's an edge, right? And then usually, if branch lengths are taken into account in trees, we'll talk about that a bit more later, there will be some sort of scale bar, and then the scale bar will have some sort of unit, which can vary. Next, we're going to talk about nodes. So we have the edges. The nodes are what connects the edges. So there's the internal, so each node represents a taxa, okay? There's external nodes, okay, and those are just these at the very tips, okay? They're also called leaves, and these represent extant species or protein sequences or DNA sequences, whatever your data are. And we also sometimes call them OTUs, or operational taxonomic units. Okay. For the sake of demonstration, I don't know, we'll say that like pengus and chomps and duckbills are all like a genus level. So like this would be like maybe a species. So in this case, our operational taxonomic unit is like a species. Okay. In terms of internal nodes, they represent hypothetical ancestors. So these are not living species or living sequences. They are hypotheses for what the ancestor between those would be. So you see here, that's the pengu ancestor, or hypothesized pengu ancestor. You know, we got like our knight pengu with the sword here, and then this is like a samurai pengu. So I'm going to hypothesize that their common ancestor was the pengu with the wooden sword. Maybe this is not a live species today. Maybe we found a fossil of the wooden sword pengu. I mean, it probably wouldn't survive very well with just a wooden sword, right? Like, so that's why I think that. Yeah, I'm hypothesizing this because I met the creator of the game, and I asked him for some like DNA sequencing data for these things, and he never got back to me. So we're just gonna pretend, okay? Likewise, we have duckbills here, right? They also supposedly have a common ancestor. Maybe this white duckbill is the ancestor to the purple and blue duckbills. And then if you go back, farther into the tree, towards the root, maybe duckbill and penguins, they're both bird things, they both have wings, right? So they probably share a common ancestor. This was the closest thing I could find. It's got like a beak like a penguin, but like the head shape is like sort of like a duckbill. That's called a silverwing. So that's what I think the common ancestor looked like for those. And then finally we have chonk here. So chonk here is related to duckbills and penguins, perhaps through this node. Okay, so this is the root. The root of a tree is the node representing the hypothetical common ancestor of all OTUs. And this was this is called poggles. I mean, it's like a dragon thing. Like it's round like a chonk. It's round and pink like a chonk, okay, but it's got wings. So I have one here. It's blue. But like, there's no way these wings could support its weight, right? So I don't think it could actually fly. And it doesn't look like any of these other birds can fly either. So that's why maybe they evolved from this thing. Just never it can't fly. So that's that. Hopefully that makes sense. And moving on, there's different types of nodes that we can talk about when we're constructing trees. So a bifurcating node, so bi means two. Okay, it's pretty simple. You have only two things splitting off from that node. And in some cases, we can have a multifurcating internal node where we have more than two. So in this specific case, we have like the pengu ancestor, right? And then we have our original like night pengu and samurai pengu. There's like a third pengu maybe we found, and then this pengu like it's holding a sword, so I don't know, it clearly evolved from the common ancestor of pengus. But in this case, because we don't know whether this third pengu is like more closely related to the sword pengu or the night pengu or the samurai pengu, that's why we're choosing to put it there. Because if we did know, then we would just bifurcate it here or here instead, right? And then because of that, this is an example of why generally for phylogenetic trees we would prefer only bifurcating nodes, because then we know exactly the distance relative to each other that each individual OTU or species is related to each other, instead of having like a relationship here that we are not able to accurately resolve. Next, we're going to move on to roots. So here in this rooted tree, we have this common ancestor. And that's number 9. In an unrooted tree, we can actually just take out this hypothetical common ancestor, and then we're not specifying it because perhaps we don't know exactly where the common ancestor to everything is, right? So that doesn't mean that there are no ancestors, right? You can see the ancestors 6, 7, and 8 here. They're still here, right? So the common ancestor to like eagle duckbill and like I don't know, hat duckbill, it's still 6, right? These relationships still hold. It's only the common ancestor to everything that's not there. This number 9, and should I demonstrate? You could also just have this common ancestor in a different place in this tree, and it would change the relationships a bit. Like for example, if you had it, so right now, 9 is here, right? If we were to put the common ancestor, you could also put it here, and then that would change the relationship of this. So it would be like 5, and then 4, This is terrible, I'm sorry. Here. 5, 4, 1, 2, 3. Sorry, that was terrible, but I might show you a better example later. This one might make more sense. Okay, so if you don't actually are not actually confident of the common ancestor of whatever species group you're studying, so for example, these are penguins and duckbills, right? So these are like the birds. What you can do is in your tree, you can actually include an outgroup. So if we know that chonk is distantly related to penguins and duckbills. So an outgroup is a taxon that's distantly related, as all things are. But we know that chonk is not expected to be within the target group. So we know chonk is not a bird. We can include chonk in the tree, and then use the chonk as an outgroup to root the tree, and then therefore that could help us find the root here, and then we know that this is all one group. Moving on to branch lengths. So there's different types of trees, and each tree has a different meaning to what the, in this case, x-axis is. So in a cladogram, there's no scale bar. There's no meaning to the branch length. So the axis means nothing. You can usually tell if something's a cladogram if like every single bifurcation, the distances are the exact same. So you can kind of just like visually see here. Every time it bifurcates, the next, on the x-axis, the next distance thing away is going to be the same distance. And that basically, it shows that these things are related, and it shows where the common ancestors are. So like these two pink chunks, they do share a more recent common ancestor than like the pink chunks and like the lava and earth chunks, right? They share a more recent ancestor than that, which is there. But we can't actually infer how recent it was. There's no like time scale, and we don't actually know how different the pink chunks are to each other compared to the lava chunk and the earth chunk, right? Moving on to a phylogram or an additive tree. So in this case, the x-axis means the evolutionary distance. So the actual measures of distance themselves can vary. There's different ways to calculate it, but it could be things like number of substitutions or number of substitutions, normalized to some value. We'll go over that in the evolutionary models lecture. But suffice to say, x-axis branch lengths are scaled towards the distance between them. So in this case, we can see that the two pink chunks, they're pretty closely related. You can kind of see that visually, they look pretty similar, right? And then proportionally, their branch lengths are quite short when we're tracking it back to their common ancestor, right? Whereas the more distantly related lava chunk and earth chunk, these branch lengths are a bit longer, right? So we can infer that they have more changes in their sequences compared to each other. And then finally, this one is, is the outgroup. And then finally, we have the ultrametric tree. So in this case, the branch lengths do matter, but they're scaled with time, and they're scaled with what we assume to be a constant rate of mutation. So remember the molecular clock hypothesis? So if the molecular clock holds true for whatever sequence we're measuring here, then everything that we measure is going to line up perfectly on the x-axis, right? Because everything is being measured at this day and age, presumably, unless we're looking at DNA from fossilized samples. And then these branch lengths are scaled again. So as you can see, short over here. So this means that these two chunks are pretty closely related to each other, both in terms of their sequence divergence, and we're also going to hypothesize that that has to do with time. So like recent. They recently diverged, right? So they've only had this amount of time, a very short amount of time to accumulate differences in their sequences. Whereas these two chunks, they diverged back here, so like, long time ago. So they have had more time to accumulate differences in their sequences. And yeah, so on and so forth. Any questions on that? Oh. Okay, final thing that we're going to talk about in relation to these animal trees are the concept of monophyletic, paraphyletic, and polyphyletic groups, okay? So, nobody really has problems with monophyletic groups. It's pretty simple, right? There's a common ancestor, and then everything on that tree that descends from that common ancestor is a monophyletic group. Okay, so here, this whole tree is a monophyletic group, but also if you take this node here, that's also a monophyletic group. Let's go here, 1 and 2 are monophyletic, and so on, right? Paraphyletic is if you take a common ancestor, and then you group some of the taxa that descend from it, but not everything. So in this case, same common ancestor, 1, 2, 4, 5, we're grouping together, but we're leaving out 3, and 3 does descend from the same common ancestor. So in this case, it's paraphyletic. We could also leave out 1, and then have 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's also paraphyletic. You could do 1, 2, 3, 4, and leave out 5, and that's also paraphyletic. Polyphyletic is if you have 2 or more groups, or taxa or whatever. Here it's saying derived from more than one common ancestor. Okay, so in this case, yes, technically they do have a common ancestor, right? Everything has a common ancestor on Earth because we all descended from the same, last universal common ancestor, if you go back far enough. But specifically to polyphyletic groups, when we're making the group, we're choosing not to include this common ancestor in that group, and that will be for a very good reason, which I will get into in the next slide. So that is the difference between polyphyletic and paraphyletic. Okay, for demonstration, again, monophyletic, pretty easy, right? So all penguins and duckbills, so the birds, are a monophyletic group. They share this common ancestor, which was presumably also a bird. We're going to hypothesize that. Also, penguins and duckbills themselves are individual monophyletic groups themselves, because duckbills are monophyletic because they share this hypothetical duckbill ancestor, and same with penguins. Penguins share a penguin ancestor, right? So each of these are also individually monophyletic. Paraphyletic is if I wanted to say a group of flightless birds in the street. Okay, so here we have these 2 penguins. They don't look like they can fly. This, and then this duckbill. It also doesn't look like it can fly. It's giving me a thumbs up. I don't know what bird can give a thumbs up like that. And then this duckbill, it somehow evolved the ability to fly. Yes, it's holding a helicopter above its head, and that's why it can fly, but we're just going to assume that that's part of its evolutionary path, okay? So if I wanted to say the group of flightless penguins and duckbills, this would be a paraphyletic group. Because while they do descend from a common ancestor that we're going to hypothesize was also a flightless bird, there is also a flying bird descended from that same common ancestor. And so therefore, if we're not including that flying bird, the group is paraphyletic. Okay? So they share a common ancestor that was like them, but there's also living species that descended from that common ancestor that is not like that common ancestor. Okay? So if we want to differ that from polyphyletic, is if I were to specify a group called the honeybee patterned animals, okay? So in this case, we have a honeybee patterned group of duckbills here. But also a honeybee patterned chonk, okay? They look similar on the outside because they have this yellow and brown striped pattern. But even though they do share this common ancestor, we're going to hypothesize that this common ancestor does not have the honeybee pattern. Right? And because of that, we're not going to include that common ancestor into the grouping. And because of that, this group is polyphyletic, right? And this usually happens if we were to make polyphyletic groups based on these traits, is because of things called convergent evolution. On these branches, the common ancestor did not have a pattern, but at some point the chonk evolved a pattern, and then the common ancestor to these 2 duckbills also evolved that pattern, and they independently of each other. And due to convergent evolution, we might group these together as one group because they share that trait, but it is actually polyphyletic. they do not share that trait due to an evolutionary relationship, the trait is not homologous. Yeah, that's my demonstration. I remember I was just like super confused when they were talking about paraphyletic and polyphyletic and evolution, because I was like, everything should have a common ancestor. But this is the reason why we distinguish between the two. It has to do with what traits we choose to identify. Okay, so we're done with these fictional animals. We'll move on to some real world examples. The most common types of polyphyletic groups in nature we see are just, physical traits that we notice across different living species, but they arose again due to convergent evolution, right? So if we were to say that this is winged animals are a group, they would be a polyphyletic group. Why? Because they all evolved wings independently from a non-winged ancestor. So birds evolved wings from reptiles, dinosaurs. Non-flying dinosaurs, right? Butterflies, they're insects, they evolved wings from, an arthropod. Those did not have wings. And then bats, they're mammals, right? Mammals and birds diverged before bats evolved wings. They evolved from like gliding squirrels and stuff. Okay? And then for paraphyletic group, we have reptiles. Or specifically, these days we tend to say non-avian reptiles, because most biologists, I guess, have just kind of accepted that birds are reptiles, and when we say reptiles, it kind of just means birds and reptiles, and so we have to specify non-avian reptiles now. Non-avian reptiles are a paraphyletic group, because if you look at this phylogeny of tetrapods, so this is everything that descended from, oh no, it doesn't have amphibians, but it's things that descended from the whatever fish decided to come up and land, and then now we have to learn evolution. It was a terrible decision. You will not be able to find a single common ancestor that is the common ancestor to all reptiles, but not to birds, right? So it would be this one for all reptiles. But as you can see, the birds also descend from it. So it would be a paraphyletic group if we were to only look at non-avian reptiles. In fact, a lot of people are surprised at this, but birds are actually more closely related to crocodiles on this tree, or as far as we know. Birds are more closely related to crocodiles than crocodiles are to like any of the other reptiles. And morphologically, that doesn't really make sense, but then you start looking at things like, oh, they both like care for their young and build nests, and yeah. Have you ever seen those videos where they put like a plunger on the back of a chicken and you see it walk? It walks just like a T-Rex, and that's why birds are reptiles. That's the undoubtable proof. Yeah. In conclusion, thanks to molecular sequencing data, we've resolved a lot of these taxonomies and phylogenies that we used to do just based on traits. And these days we generally want everything to be in monophyletic groupings. So remember tax browser? You could look at the hierarchical groupings and everything. I don't think reptilia is a valid term there anymore. So now we have archosaurs and something, and lepidosaurs. I'm not an animal person, but it's pretty cool, I guess. Okay, so that's that for different types of groups on trees. In terms of actually displaying trees, so we have